activism masquerading as journalism. And that, for me, in that moment, revealed to me what was happening at Sky. In terms of their activism, was worse than the BBC.
Why do you think that happened? What was it that set that journey in motion that took us to where we are today?
This isn't just abstract reasoning about the way the media work. This can affect lives.
Something I've noticed over a long time, when another part of the BBC is in crisis, BBC News could not be more excited about it. When the subject of controversy is BBC News, but they don't really want to talk about it. And I think that's a fundamental problem.
Danny, is it just going to be business as usual at the BBC?
Jonathan Monroe was challenged in the Editorial Standards Committee on BBC Arabic. One of his lines of defence was, well, we're nearly as popular on BBC Arabic as Al Jazeera. And there's been no denial of that was said. That is staggering.
How do we balance accountability with freedom of speech?
I don't think it's possible with the BBC.
I think it's pretty scary, and I wish I had a good answer, but I don't know how you put that genie back in the bottle now.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink. I'm Andrew Fox.
And I'm Jake Wallace-Simons, and today we have two guests for you. The first, Colin Brazier, was a presenter at Sky News for 25 years. He's joined by Danny Cohen, the former director of television at the BBC and the former controller of BBC One.
Both Colin and Danny have become critics of the mainstream media. And today they're going to be drawing on their own experience to explore how progressive ideology came to dominate so much of contemporary broadcasting.
Now, with Christmas and Hanukkah on the way, be sure to check out our new range of merch at thebrinkmerch.com and check out our t-shirts, hoodies, cups, and other bits and bobs that you might want to get for Christmas presents.
And if you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow us, leave a comment, and if you're listening on audio, please do give us 5 stars.
Now we present Colin Brazier and Danny Cohen on The Brink.
Colin, Danny, welcome to The Brink.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Now, the BBC have had the lion's share of the criticism of late, but I think we can make the case that Sky News have had something of a free pass. So, Colin, I was wondering if we could start by you talking us through your experience with Sky, how you found it, where we got to, where we are today.
I was originally in newspapers, then went to the BBC and made a conscious decision in the mid-90s that the BBC was not a place I could feel free to express my view of the world. So I thought, Sky, Murdoch, that's where you go. Sky News was the new kid on the block. It was the upstart. It was anti-establishment. And over the 25 years I was there, it morphed into an institution actually which out-BBC'd the BBC. Last year, I saw a tweet from Andrew Neil, who was briefly in charge of Sky News back in the 90s. And he was criticising some Sky coverage of Israel, and I retweeted it with some additional comments pointing out that, in my opinion, Sky News had become the home of activism, not journalism, and effectively had become, quote, the paramilitary wing of Channel 4 News. And I got a call from a senior figure at Sky saying, how can you say this? And I'll just briefly sum up what I said to him, which is by dint of a couple of examples. One was during the height of COVID, I was driving in to cover a show that wasn't mine on a Thursday evening and got a call from a producer who said, on the stroke of 8 p.m, we want you to get from behind your desk and go and stand at the big news wall. We'll take a live picture of Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer, and then we'll have you applauding on the stroke of 8 o'clock. And I said, well, look, I didn't get out of my seat for the last lot of heroes when they were brought back in coffins to RAF Bryce Norton. And I see no reason why we should do it this time, because once the wheel of journalistic fate turns half a screw, we'll have to be critical of doctors and nurses, but we'll have perhaps spaffed our credibility to some degree. And that, for me, in that moment, revealed to me what was happening at Sky. It wasn't top down. There was no corporate decision to go easy on doctors and nurses or deify their activities. There was something that was bottom up from the newsroom. And I can give you countless examples of that sort of activism masquerading as journalism. And as I say, for me, ultimately Sky, in terms of their activism, was worse than the BBC, with the one caveat that, of course, at the end of the day, if you choose to be so offended by Sky's output, you can cancel your subscription, and that's fine, in a way that, of course, isn't isn't possible at the BBC. So there's a distinction there still.
I suppose to cut to the nub of this then, why do you think that happened? What was it that set that journey in motion that took us to where we are today?
I think there was a corporate impulse to wash Rupert Murdoch right out of their hair. I think they felt contaminated by the Murdoch legacy, particularly when Comcast took over. I think you saw that in things like the execrable half-hour daily climate change show, which wasn't journalism, purely activism, but it was designed to say, we are no longer the Sky that was. We are a new kind of Sky where we're aware of environmental problems, but actually behind that there was all kinds of other activities masquerading as journalism. So I think there was a corporate element, but as I say, there was also from the bottom up, and you saw it in things like Black Lives Matter. There was a push from the newsroom to cover that in an almost hysterical way. You saw it in particular, and the first time I noticed it was 2015, the migration crisis. There was a determination not to ask skeptical questions about the motives of people trying to get to the UK. And I think that bled directly then into the events of 2016 in terms of what was happening in the newsroom. There were tears, by the way, on the morning of the Brexit vote in the Sky newsroom. And of course, the corrosive effect of public trust in mainstream media, and obviously for Sky, of the way they covered the migration crisis then directly, I think, led into a corrosion of trust around Brexit. And just finally, on Brexit, I mean, I've lost count of the number of times I've moderated debates at Sky about, the morning after a by-election and turnout had been risible, and we'd bring our hands and clutch our pearls and say, voter apathy. And then, of course, when the voters were engaged in the political process around Brexit, there was horror that they were engaged in a way that didn't fit with the narrative.
Are there any other examples that you could furnish us with before we move on to Danny and talk about Israel that have occurred to you personally while you're in Sky, or even that you've seen since where you've just thought that really sums it up? You mentioned there were so many. Can you give us a few more?
I mean, it was an incremental thing more than anything else. The COVID example is my personal example of how there was a determination to tell a story in a particular way. Can I just switch this around a little bit and tell a personal story actually about the BBC, which I'm slightly jumping the gun on? But I think it begins to explain why I have a deep-rooted skepticism of the way mainstream media work, whether it's Sky or whether it's the BBC. And when it comes to the doctoring of the Trump speech recently, I thought back to the early noughties. I'd been embedded for Sky with the American 3rd Infantry Division, and I remember coming home and hearing that there was a bit of a stink about a former colleague of mine, James Forlong, who had filed a report from a Royal Navy submarine, and he'd cut together library footage with their own raw footage. And a week or so later, the BBC sent a documentary crew onto the same submarine and said, where's the big red button that launches the missiles? There is no big red button. It's just a mouse. Oh, but Sky came and they filmed this. No, it didn't happen. They just used library footage. And the BBC made quite a commotion about this, and their documentary about the Second Gulf War. This was a story they were using to push it and publicise it, and they did so in combination with a Guardian front page, which drew attention to Sky News's attitude or lax attitude towards truth telling. James Forlong, who was the correspondent who did this, was lost his job, and 3 months later he took his own life. The extent to which the BBC will protect itself from commercial rivals, I'm sure Danny can talk about that to some degree. But for me, that was a personal introduction to what happens. Sometimes the culture wars can be very bloody and leave a personal toll. And it's left me with a visceral hatred, I think that's too strong, of the BBC.
So what you're saying is that the BBC criticise Sky for doing the sort of thing that they do for commercial gain because they're a competitor.
What I'm saying is that for the BBC to say, look, we doctored a Trump clip, it's not such a heinous crime. And I think back to the brouhaha. I think back to the stink they raised in the noughties around James, which ultimately led to his sacking and his death. I mean, look, people take their own lives for a variety of reasons is never enough to sort of to draw that connection. But for me, that stays with me as an example of how this isn't just abstract reasoning about the way the media work. This can affect lives.
And this is visceral as well. I mean, we've seen that with the BBC. I think the thing that's shocked me most about the whole BBC crisis that unfolded, that began to unfold with the report and then the Trump element of that and so on, has been the BBC's response. I mean, it has been a response of conspiracy theory, pointing out the one, so far as I can see, conservative-leaning member of the board.
With a connection to the Jewish community.
With a connection to the Jewish community.
Very interesting how...
And saying it was all him. But he was only one of... I mean, how could... Is he one... As if one person could be behind this whole...
I was very struck at the Select Committee this week that a Labour member of the Select Committee actually referenced his prior relationship to the Jewish Chronicle, that was a subject of such import that it was worth discussing at the Select Committee. I was very, very struck by that as a line of questioning. You see that in 2 or 3 different ways with the BBC. First of all, as you say, Jake, the immediate reaction was essentially a distraction technique. Don't look at the substance. There must be a conspiracy here. It's a right-wing coup and all of that. And I think, I'm not saying those people didn't believe it, because I think they did in a strange way, because they found it so hard to imagine there might be a problem and they're part of the organization that has a problem. But I think that what it was also attempted to do is distract attention, actually quite successfully, in terms of how some of it was reported, from the substance of the report, which has some very, very serious information in it and evidence, to theories about who was responsible and why they were acting as they did. The other thing that really strikes me in all of this is how the BBC News then reports from BBC News. Because something I've noticed over a long time, from when I was there and since, is when another part of the BBC is in crisis, BBC News could not be more excited about it. And it's very, very high profile news on the BBC. Strictly Come Dancing, the awful situation around Russell Brand in relation to the entertainment program involved in, but time and again on many, many different things, MasterChef, all of these kinds of things. When the subject of controversy is BBC News, they might do a story on it. If they do, it's certainly not the headline story as it would be on if it was a BBC entertainment story, let alone something about Sky. But they don't really want to talk about it. And they'll avoid talking about it, I think, as much as they can. In my own personal case, I've been struck over the last 2 years, as you know, people may know, I've been critical of the BBC on their coverage of Israel and Gaza. I mainly got approached by the BBC in that period to ask if I'd come on to talk about Strictly Come Dancing or something else. Almost never, until the press got reports, about the critique I was making of the BBC. And actually, I started replying to those requests saying, you know, not your fault, but respectfully, you know, I've been talking about the BBC for a couple of years on something very serious, and I'm not invited on, so I really don't want to come on instead and talk about, you know, Strictly Come Dancing. And so I think there's something interesting about how it holds itself to account as a news organization, as well as all of these things around, you know, it can't be us, it must be a right-wing coup. And I don't think there's a right-wing coup going on in any way. There's been a very serious report, which the BBC should take very seriously, on issues of bias and journalistic failure.
It feels to me, I mean, what you're both articulating is the way in which the obligations of impartiality for the BBC, and something similar with Sky, credibility, only go skin deep when your heart and your animal passions lead you in another direction. You can quite easily warp, you know, all those professional principles and give it a new presentation, a new sheen to justify something that really runs contrary to them deep down. And I think that we see that in no more vivid case than in Israel, wouldn't you say?
No, I'd completely agree. And, you know, your opinions on Anton Zibek aside.
I actually like him very much.
What score would you give him?
Yeah, he's a very charismatic man.
You know, the question I think for me sits as to the why. Again, it's the same question I really asked Colin is, and I think the why for the BBC from your perspective would be really interesting to see if there is that overlap.
So
especially when it comes to Israel.
is BBC News is populated by a lot of hardworking, generally very well-meaning, committed professionals. But what I don't think they can see is that they are bringing bias into the newsroom. And there's a certain amount of hubris, I think, in the BBC and the BBC newsroom that makes them feel so absolutely certain that they absolutely occupy the impartial centre ground that to accuse them otherwise is a heinous crime and couldn't possibly be true. But let me take myself as an example. I was probably part of that when I was there, right? I was born in London. I went to Oxford University. I studied English literature. I was left of centre in my politics. I tried very hard to leave my politics at the door, as you should at the BBC. Probably didn't all of the time. And I wasn't in news, so it probably mattered a lot less. It had very little impact. I was on the television side, non-news. So I don't think people there realise that what they think, to some extent, they think they're the centre. They think they're impartial. They don't believe or understand. And they can't even become cognizant of the idea that that might not be the case. And then I think there are others where, as Colin said, I think there's pure activist journalism going on, and which hasn't been dealt with. And I think that's the case. The Prescott report suggests it on gender ideology and has some very convincing evidence on that. I think there's some activism journalism going on Gaza and Hamas and Israel. I think there's clearly some activism journalism going on at Sky on Gaza and Israel and Hamas. So I think there's two categories. There's the category of almost conscious, if not totally conscious, activism journalism from a kind of maybe pure-hearted liberal perspective of, I know I'm right, this stuff is really bad, I must report the truth in their minds. But also a sense of kind of hubristic belief that they are right at the centre, and therefore anything that doesn't agree with their position is either left of centre or right of centre, rather than them not being at the centre. And I think that's a fundamental problem. And the only way you can address that is a really open, long-term conversation within the BBC about how you adjust from that. The one final thing I say on that is that, and I understand these are generalizations, I think a younger generation of journalists coming through are perhaps even more prone to that than some of their senior colleagues, because they've grown up in a more polarized world. They have, this is my truth. We know all of that kind of language that's developed in the last 10 or 15 years. They see the world in a particular way and are so believed in the righteousness of that. And you saw it on university campuses and in America and Britain as well, that they believe that it's their duty to report things in a certain way rather than maintain the impartiality that being at the BBC should demand.
See, I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective from Jake, because obviously Jake is a hard-bitten Fleet Street man. Colin, you've done 25 years at Sky. Obviously, you've had a long and distinguished media career, whereas I'm a complete outsider to that kind of mainstream media world. So that's the perspective I'm really looking at it from. And I think nothing surprised me more over the last sort of period of reporting on Israel, Gaza particularly, than the now former head of BBC News giving that Zoom call where she advised her staff to distinguish between Hamas, the governance, and Hamas, the militants. Now, as someone who makes an academic career out of studying the Middle East and this zone, that completely blew my mind, because it's so factually incorrect. The two things are indivisible. You've got the very head of the news organisations giving incorrect and explicit direction as to how to approach this problem.
And the other example that's really stuck in my mind, actually, from the events the last couple of weeks, which has an echo of that, is the Prescott report tells us that when Jonathan Munro, who's now acting head of news, was challenged in the editorial standards committee on BBC Arabic, which is a whole, connected but unbelievably toxic subject. One of his lines of defense was, well, we're nearly as popular on BBC Arabic as Al Jazeera. I mean, really, and there's been no denial of that was said. That is staggering. And I think the pushback was, well, is Al Jazeera the standard we're aiming to attain to? But I think what lies behind it is so interesting, because what lies behind it is, to me, a complete misunderstanding of the purpose of the BBC and the BBC World Service, which is to spread British values to the rest of the world. The idea isn't just to be popular in a region. I think it's quite possible you could, maybe I'm being unfair, you could possibly be more popular on BBC Arabic if you're anti-Israel and sometimes anti-Semitic. I'm not saying all Arabs in that region are, but you could be probably quite popular with some there if you take that approach, particularly the anti-Israel part. So the idea that your editorial position should be based on growing audiences and that is the data point that matters, is really, really shocking, and I think has echoes of what you're saying around that very, very odd, factually incorrect and disturbing division between different parts of Hamas.
Can I just say, I think that growing audiences actually is less of a problem in this sense, and I hesitate before I throw myself into this simile in the company I'm in, but it's a little bit like two bald men fighting over a comb in terms of Sky and the BBC, because smartphones, independent media, what's happening online is stealing their lunch in audience terms. And actually, I think in some respects they're reluctant to look their audience in the eye. And I think that was true on Brexit. I think it's true on migration. And I think what they still do, of course, is want a metric by which they can justify their license fee funded salaries in the BBC's case. Yeah. And the way they go about that is saying the metric that matters isn't ratings anymore because they're awful and declining, and the long-term trends are clear. The metric we will use to define success is industry baubles and accolades and the approbation of our peers. And I hear it again and again. There was an interview done, I won't mention the name of the presenter on the Today programme, not so very long ago, and I was, as usual, screaming at the radio because you sensed that this was a presenter who had rear view mirrors on their shoulders and was looking into the newsroom to see the cheers they were getting as they landed blow after blow. The principal motivation was not a skeptical examination of the facts or uncovering perhaps motivation or any of the journalistic verities that we ought to be looking for. It was simply playing woke bingo and hitting all the right notes, not for the listeners, but for their contemporaries in the newsroom.
Who was the presenter?
No. No.
It's like a journo on journo crime.
Colin, I mean, one thing that Danny said, I feel very vividly, which is that in the BBC and elsewhere in the mainstream media, Sky and elsewhere, there's a sense that impartiality or objectivity is the same as having a left-wing worldview. That just is how the world is constructed and how we see things. But just to play devil's advocate in your regard, you recently joined the Reform Party. You've made no secret of your own politics.
I did for 25 years, though.
Right. Although latterly, somebody trying to defend Sky might say, yes, but you're only coming from your own subjective political point of view, making these criticisms about Brexit, about migration, about and other things, because that's where you're coming from. You're equally as impartial as Sky News. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'd say that I hesitated before I saw my role as partly being somebody who would be a critic of Sky. Sky were very good to me in dark times. I mean, my late wife had many of her medical bills paid through the largesse of Sky's medical insurance scheme. I'm not ungrateful for that. They were very supportive during some very difficult moments. But there comes a moment in the life of every single institution when they reach a certain level of institutional maturity. The BBC's been there for many, many decades, where it is possible for former employees to turn back to an institution and say, look, you're getting this wrong. And I think that the BBC's replete with people like that who've been doing it for decades. Sky haven't. But I think Sky have reached that point where they're important to the national conversation, kind of. I mean, let's not forget in all this that the disproportionate influence of, say, Sky News it has to be borne in mind. I mean, they've got very few viewers and customers, but they have enormous and disproportionate reach because they're watched in newsrooms, they're watched in government offices, they're watched in PR offices. So, it's important to remember that influence that they have is disproportionate, but it's also important. It was important for me to look at the institution and say, I'm one of the people who can speak with some authority based purely in the time that I spent there. My late wife was the foreign editor at Sky as well, so it was that perspective too. And I think it's just what happens when an institution, rightly or wrongly, and as I say, based on figures probably wrongly, is part of the national discourse and conversation, which Sky News has become. So I felt not a scintilla of guilt.
Is there anybody who feels that Sky News is not left-wing enough?
Well, you asked earlier for a specific example, and I was thinking, actually, there was a moment when I noticed on the Sky News website, this was 5-6 years ago, and there was a story about Sam Smith, the singer whose work we're all more than familiar with, of course. And the story was referring to him as they. He no longer wanted to be known by his birth gender. And And I read the copy in good faith, and I got down to sort of paragraph 6 and thought, this is an impediment to lucidity. I'm not really understanding what's going on here. So I went to a senior management figure at Sky and said, look, I'm not coming at this with any kind of axe to grind. I'm just as a punter wondering whether this is clear. And again, I won't say who it was, but they came in during an ad break while I was on air and basically sort of read a statement back at me about diversity and inclusion. And there were individuals within the newsroom, a bit like in publishing houses, who feel it's their job to cancel authors or make sure Roald Dahl doesn't mention black tractors or whatever it is. There are, and as Danny says, there's a generational thing now. There is a cohort coming through who feel no sense of awkwardness about dictating terms of journalistic engagement. And it was apparent certainly on trans questions. I think you saw a lot of it in Sky's hysterical reaction towards Black Lives Matter, and certainly on Israel as well, where the fashionable opinion is here. Does Sky go beyond that? I think sometimes we can probably think of examples where they do. I think that they don't have some of the blocks on their behaviour that the BBC does, and some of the checks and balances there. That's worth bearing in mind as well.
How do you mean?
Well, there is a willingness to navel gaze within the BBC. Programs explicitly looking at on Radio 4, which I forget the name of the presenter. Feedback. But I think they take their news seriously through different institutions, layers of institutions, which some of those checks and balances just are they there at Sky? I'm not sure they are.
I mean, it seems that really this has all come to a head over the last couple of years with regard to Israel, and the reporting about Israel and Gaza. And to me, I've seen examples of biased journalism and omission of fact and the warping of fact that have even taken me by surprise. But it feels to me as if particularly the BBC, in its response to the current scandal, seems to be focusing its attention on an apology of Trump, although they use the word unintentional in that apology, which seems to me to be a little bit missing the point. But focusing all the focus on that, and then ignoring all the other stuff. And there was a lot of bad stuff in that report about BBC Arabic, about other elements of BBC News. I mean, Danny, is it just going to be business as usual at the BBC with regard to Israel and Gaza?
So I think you're right in how they responded. I think the Trump one, listen, if you manipulate the speech of the most powerful man on the planet, and it's so very, very clear, that's going to be the main headline. Anyone in news will know that's going to be the main headline. I think at the same time, it's an easier one to say it was a mistake. It's harder to say it's a mistake when actually Newsnight did the same. But
2 years before.
2 years before, but it's easier to call it a mistake. A lot of the other material in the Prescott report was about systemic biases. And this is the area and the phrase that I think the BBC is really terrified of and doesn't want to acknowledge. There was something came out in the newsroom the other day about Richard Burgess, who's a very senior figure there, talking about how on the trans stuff, he said, I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me if this isn't accurate, but I don't think we've got everything. No one would say we've got everything right on trans. It was interesting along those lines. Forgive me if I misquoted him, I apologize. And so it seemed to me they were admitting something on that a little bit, acknowledging something at least on that. They've acknowledged the issue around Trump. Israel, Gaza, no movement, even on BBC Arabic. And to me, that's quite interesting. Now, at the same time, I think what's happened with those senior resignations is a shock to the system for the BBC, and that may have an impact. You'd also hope that whoever comes in as Director General and the new head of news is coming into an environment where the two previous people have resigned as part of a scandal around journalistic failure and bias, and that they may have that at the top of their agenda. The one thing I would say is I do think this is an opportunity for the BBC if they have the bravery and the courage to take it, because it's a big moment, it's a big crisis. Can you get something at least positive out of a crisis? And I think what would be positive is if they had the courage to acknowledge and have an open conversation at the very least about issues of bias in the newsroom, rather than this super defensive, categorical, binary, nothing to see here. There's no issues with systemic bias in our newsroom. And I think that, the Prescott report and other things we see make very clear there are some issues. But the BBC's failure so far and unwillingness to embrace that is the non-optimistic or the pessimistic view one might have on this, because until you acknowledge you've got a problem, you can't really begin to fix it. And they must acknowledge to some extent they've got a problem in order to remedy this issue they've got. And it's super important they do so, because, the BBC at its best should be that gold standard journalism. And we all want it to be that. I certainly want it to be that. I believe in the license fee and I want the BBC to thrive. So there's two pathways the organisation can go on now. The optimistic view is you open up a conversation, you'll never get it perfect, but you have the courage to have that conversation and see what can be done about it around systemic issues of left-leaning bias. Or you put up the barricades, you defend. As a result of that, you don't solve the problems, and this problem will emerge again, and over time be very corrosive for the BBC's reputation.
Doesn't the sort of the systemic allegation give a kind of free pass to certain journalists that just simply haven't been doing their job well enough?
Yeah, I think that's fair. But then it becomes systemic because no one in more senior positions is doing anything about it. So you in that you're right, Andrew. But in that case, you get both. Really, you get failures of individuals, but you also get an organisation. And this is why I personally think there's an institutional problem, because it's institutional. Because I think you're right. It comes up from the newsroom. But it's institutional because the people at the top don't do enough about it to deal with it. So it becomes an institutional problem, and it becomes an institutional issue because there's no way of fixing it. So it becomes not just bottom up in the way I think you've described, but top down because there's no way of addressing it effectively. And that's a really serious problem for an organisation, the BBC, that requires the appreciation of the British people to continue to pay the licence fee.
So where does accountability, I'm talking for both Sky and BBC, where does that come from in this scenario? Because I think we can be fair and say, look, nobody is perfectly unbiased. Like, that just doesn't happen. If we look at the psychology of how a human being grows up from child to adult, there will always be certain biases and certain influences that affect how you see the world, and that will be reflected in how you then assess facts. And especially in potentially a new situation where it's fast moving, there's developments all the time, there's going to be bias creeping in. I think we can give a degree of leeway there. But when there is an egregious error that should have been corrected, like Jeremy Bowen with the Al-Ahli hospital bombing, where, he jumped the gun hugely, reported a complete falsehood about Israel bombing a hospital. And there were protests outside the embassy within minutes of that happening.
Then he said he didn't regret it after.
Yeah, this is a serious failure of journalism with real world repercussions where there's been no kind of even apology from the journalists that got it so badly wrong. How do we balance accountability with freedom of speech?
I don't think it's possible with the BBC. I'm sorry, Danny, I don't think it's reformable. I think it's incorrigible. And I say that reluctantly because I am a sort of Burkean conservative. I believe in institutions. And I worry when I see some of the stuff on Twitter from the right saying that, institutions increasingly can't be remedied, whether it's the police too woke, the royal family too woke, the church too woke, BBC too woke. I just don't see how some of those systemic problems are recoverable at the BBC. So I am an abolitionist. I don't want to abolish the BBC, but I do see no further justification for an obligatory licence fee.
How do you feel about the licence fee, Danny?
I'm a believer in it. I want to believe the BBC can reform. You may find the same. More and more people say to me, writing to me after my columns or other people in, the community I'm in, say, I don't want to pay anymore. You do get that happening more and more, but it's not what I believe. I want to continue to believe that reform is possible and that it can be what we'd hope it would be and that it's an important institution. But it's going to require courageous leadership in order to get there. And this is the big question, will we see that kind of courageous leadership?
Is there a way to get courageous leadership into the organisation other than by appointment from outside? And is that even possible?
If you've been enjoying the conversation so far, don't panic. To catch the rest of the episode, just head over to our Substack at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk. And don't forget to grab a copy of my brand new book, Never Again: How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself, in all good bookshops now.